At first light on the 24th of April, 1951, an American officer told a company of Australian soldiers that they were already dead. He had a casualty report in front of him, and the report was certain. The 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment had been overrun in the night, wiped out on a hill north of a Korean town nobody in Washington had heard of, and the voice now insisting otherwise on the radio net in a broad and unmistakable accent could only be an enemy trick. A Chinese operator with good English trying to lure American guns onto an empty ridge. Except the ridge was not empty. The man holding the handset was Major Ben O'Dowd, surrounded on 3 sides by a Chinese division, his ammunition running down, and he was not dead. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of Kapyong, or of the man who held it before today? Because what you are about to learn will change how you think about who stopped the road to Seoul, and about who was given the credit for it. Now let's go. To understand how a battalion came to be reported as annihilated while it was still fighting, you first have to understand the war that produced the report. A war that Australians of a later generation would struggle to remember, and that many Australians of the time preferred not to think about at all. It had begun in June of 1950, when the Army of Communist North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and very nearly drove the defenders of the South into the sea. The United States led a United Nations coalition into the peninsula, halted the collapse at the Pusan perimeter in the far southeast, and then, in one of the great reversals of modern warfare, landed at Incheon behind the enemy and drove the North Korean army back across the parallel and on toward the Yalu River and the Chinese border. It looked, for a few weeks in the autumn of 1950, like a finished victory. Then China entered the war. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army came down out of the northern mountains in the cold, and the United Nations advance turned into one of the longest retreats in American military history. A bitter winter withdrawal that surrendered the southern capital, Seoul, for the 2nd time in a single year. Seoul would change hands 4 times before the war was finished. A ruined city traded back and forth, and the men who fought over it learned a particular kind of war, one of long marches and sudden ambushes, of cold so deep that the wounded died of it, of an enemy who moved at night on foot and in numbers that no amount of Western firepower seemed able to exhaust. By the spring of 1951, the front had stabilized roughly along the old border, and the Chinese command had prepared the blow that was meant to finish the war. It was called the Spring Offensive, the largest Chinese effort of the entire conflict, and its first objective was the recapture of Seoul. In the 3rd week of April, the Chinese pulled back a little, deliberately, drawing the United Nations line forward into ground where it could be enveloped. And then, on the night of the 22nd of April, they struck along a broad front with a weight of infantry the defenders had not imagined possible. Far to the west, on the Imjin River, a British brigade and the Gloucestershire Regiment were about to be surrounded and very nearly destroyed in a stand that would become one of the most famous last fights in British history. And in the center, in a deep valley running north near a town called Kapyong, some 60 kilometers northeast of Seoul, the offensive fell upon the 6th Division of the Republic of Korea, the formation holding the head of the valley, and the 6th Division broke. It did not bend or give ground in good order. It broke, and its soldiers came streaming south down the valley road in the darkness, and behind them, mingled in among them, came the Chinese. The road they were running down led to Seoul, and standing across that road, with a few hours to prepare and a frontage far too wide for the men available, was the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade. The brigade was a mixture of Australian, Canadian, British, and New Zealand units that had been fighting in Korea since the previous year, and it had been promised a rest. For 5 days, its soldiers had enjoyed the small luxuries of a reserve area, the first wash in weeks, a beer ration, a film screened in the open air, and they expected to be pulled out of the line for good. Then, on the morning of the 23rd of April, the warning to move came, and within hours, the company commanders were out on the ground, working out how to hold a thing that could not really be held. The town of Kapyong was the reason it had to be held at all, because it sat astride one of the main routes running east and west behind the battle line, so that an enemy who seized it could unhinge a whole stretch of the front and pour through toward the capital. The plan rested on 2 battalions placed on the high ground on either side of the valley, where a tributary joined the Kapyong River. On the western side, on a dominating feature the maps called Hill 677, the Canadians of the 2nd Battalion of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry would dig in. On the eastern side, on a long ridge rising to a summit the maps called Hill 504, the Australians of the 3rd Battalion would dig in. Behind them sat the 1st Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment in reserve, and in support were the 25-pounder guns of the 16th Field Regiment of the Royal New Zealand Artillery and a single company of American tanks. Against what was coming, it was a very small force, and the men placing it knew that. The Australians who climbed those hills were not new to war. The 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment had a nickname, Old Faithful, earned the hard way fighting north through the previous autumn. And a great many of its soldiers were veterans of the Second World War who had come back into uniform through a special recruiting scheme. Men who had already fought the Germans or the Japanese and had chosen to do it again. Their commanding officer through the advance had been Charles Green, a soldier of unusual gifts, and Green had been mortally wounded by a stray shell and had died on the 1st of November, 1950. Command passed a week later, on the 8th of November, to a man named Bruce Ferguson. Ferguson was, in a small irony of empire, a New Zealander commanding the Australians. Born in Wellington in 1917, the only child of divorced parents, and a working journalist when the Second World War broke out. He had enlisted as a private, served as a brigade intelligence officer in the desert at Bardia and Tobruk, and fought along the Kokoda Trail in the jungle of New Guinea. In a battalion that came out of the fighting around Sanananda, able to muster only 88 men out of more than 500. He emerged from that war with, in the dry verdict of his biographers, a very good eye for terrain and an excellent head for a map. He was a capable and a courageous officer, and the days that were coming would test both qualities in ways no exercise could have rehearsed. But the man whose name belongs at the center of this story did not, when it began, command the battalion at all. He commanded one of its 4 rifle companies, a company, and his name was Bernard Shelley O'Dowd, known to everyone as Ben. He had been born in Perth on the 2nd of June, 1918, and almost nothing about his beginnings suggested the figure he would become. Not a son of privilege, a ward of the state, taken into care at the age of 4, out of school by 14, fending for himself through the Depression as a machinist, as a cook, and as a miner on the gold fields at Kalgoorlie, working the deep ore as what the diggers called a bogger. He had enlisted as a private in 1939, been wounded in the Middle East, and then, in the jungle fighting of New Guinea, had been decorated for bravery and commissioned in the field, given the gallantry award that a warrant officer could receive in place of the officer's medal. The rules denied him. He was exactly the kind of soldier the official record tends to mislay. A man without education or connection, who had made himself, by competence under fire, into an officer his men would follow anywhere. He had been a temporary major for 4 months, and at Kapyong he was about to show why the soldiers who served under him would spend the rest of their lives insisting that history had not understood what he did. One more officer belongs in this account before the shooting starts, because his presence on that hill carried a meaning larger than the battle. He commanded C Company, and his name was Reg Saunders. He was a Gunditch Mara man from western Victoria, the son of a First World War machine gunner, named for an uncle who had won the military medal and been killed in France. He had fought through Greece and Crete in the Second World War. And on Crete, after the island fell, he had hidden in the hills and evaded capture for close to a year before getting away to fight again. In 1944, he had become the first Aboriginal Australian ever commissioned as an officer in his country's army. And now, at Kapyong, he would become the first to command an infantry company in action. Consider what that meant in the Australia of 1951. Saunders belonged to a people who across much of the country could not vote, who were managed under special laws, and who were not always thanked for the wars they kept volunteering to fight. He had earned his commission the hardest way there is, and he wore it without fuss. But the rank sat inside a nation that had not yet made up its mind whether men like him were fully its own. He made no speeches about it. He simply did the job and let the doing be the argument. What he said about Kapyong afterward is one of the things this story exists to record. But it only makes sense once you know what the company did. Across the valley, the Canadians on Hill 677 were led by Jim Stone, a hard and clear-headed veteran of the Italian campaign who would prove, before the battle ended, that he had no intention of giving up his height for anyone. The New Zealand gunners behind both battalions would fire their 25-pounders until the barrels glowed, and they would matter more than any single weapon on the field. And the American tanks belonged to A Company of the 72nd Heavy Tank Battalion, under a Lieutenant Kenneth Koch. Formidable machines against an enemy who had brought no armor of his own. The ground these men had been given was, by any honest assessment, close to impossible. The valley was some 7 kilometers wide, far too broad a frontage for 2 understrength battalions of perhaps 700 men each to seal. And the gaps between positions were measured in hundreds of meters of dead ground that no rifle could cover at night. The night that was coming would be clear and cold, with snow still lying on the slopes that faced away from the sun. The Australians arranged their companies around the long ridge of Hill 504, with battalion headquarters in low ground near a ford across the river, the crossing that was both the position's lifeline and its back door. The tanks came forward onto the valley floor, and here the arrangement acquired a feature that matters to the way this story has since been told. They were not placed under Australian command. Koch was, in the language of the official history, left free to fight his own battle alongside the Australians rather than under them. Hold on to that, because in the retellings, the arrangement would harden into something it was not. There was one more thing, a small thing, that proved O'Dowd read the battlefield more clearly than most. As the position was being settled, he worried aloud that the enemy would not come straight at the hills, but would slip in among the refugees and the retreating South Koreans who were certain to flood through the line. And he proposed a checkpoint to filter the crowd before it reached the rear. The suggestion was not taken up. Within hours, it would prove the most accurate prediction anyone made that day, and the price of ignoring it would be paid after dark, around the battalion's own headquarters. The road filled with people in the early evening of the 23rd of April. First came the soldiers of the broken 6th Division, moving fast and without order, and the civilians of the valley carrying what they could carry. And then, within minutes, mingled into the same darkness and moving at the same pace, came the Chinese. It was almost impossible to tell the two apart. 2 Asian armies on the same road in the same night. And that was precisely the point. Because the men coming down the Kapyong Valley were not a disorganized mob, and they were not the mindless human wave of later cliché. These were the troops of the 118th Division, and their vanguard, the 354th Regiment, had raced something like 20 kilometers down the valley in pursuit of the collapsing South Koreans, moving so fast that they had outrun the bulk of their own artillery, gambling speed against firepower in a way that took both nerve and discipline. They masked their approach inside the refugee column exactly as O'Dowd had foreseen. Behind them came a second formation, the 60th Division, and the combined Chinese strength thrown into this sector ran to perhaps 20,000 men. Against them, on the two hills, stood fewer than 1,500. The first to feel it were the tanks. Koch's vehicles were forward on the valley floor without infantry to shield them. And as the Chinese came on in the dark, the tank commanders fought from open turrets because the night was too black to fight closed down, firing into the shapes moving toward them. The Chinese closed the distance and swarmed the machines with grenades, working in among them where the tank's guns could not depress to reach, and the armor was forced back. It was the correct decision, and it cost the valley floor. And as the tanks withdrew, the Chinese turned on the infantry. The vanguard split as it reached the low ridge at the mouth of the valley, the ground where B Company and a tank platoon had been placed, and flowed around both sides of it like water around a stone. And a third Chinese battalion did exactly what O'Dowd had warned they would do, swinging wide around the left to fall upon the battalion headquarters in the low ground by the river. Before 10 o'clock that evening, firing broke out in the rear, and every forward company understood in the same instant what it meant. They were cut off. The only question now was how long the enemy would take to organize the work of destroying them. Through the rest of that night, the Chinese pressed the Australian hills without pause, attacking in waves that came on over their own dead. And the fighting in places came down to the oldest tools of the infantry, the grenade and the bayonet. B Company, on its knoll near the river, found Chinese soldiers occupying old bunkers on the same small hill. And the fight for those bunkers was hand-to-hand and close enough to touch. Boots, rifle butts, bare hands, a matter of meters and of who saw whom first. When the enemy could not break B Company, they shifted their weight onto A Company, O'Dowd's men, strung along the ridge that climbed toward the summit, and for hour after hour they probed that line, feeling for the soft place, the gap, the seam where a man could slip through. They found one. A gap had opened that O'Dowd simply did not have the men to fill, and the Chinese machine gunners pushed through it and had to be hunted down and killed inside the perimeter before the line could be sealed again. In the center of the battalion, placed so that it could throw its weight toward either flank as the night demanded, was C Company under Reg Saunders, the steadying hand in a fight that had no front and no rear and no shape a diagram could hold. To picture that night, you have to strip away the tidy arrows of a map and put in their place noise and cold and an almost total darkness. The Chinese announced their assaults with bugles and whistles, the signals by which their officers controlled men they could not see, and the sound of them coming out of the black was a thing the Australians who lived through it never forgot. The defenders fought with what an infantry section carries: the short barking Owen guns at close quarters, the Bren guns in measured bursts to husband ammunition, grenades thrown downhill at sounds rather than at shapes. Flares went up and turned the snow a sudden white and caught the attackers halfway up the slope, and then died, and left the eyes worse than before. The cold pressed on everyone without distinction, stiffening fingers on triggers, and the wounded who could not be moved lay where they had fallen and endured it. The waves came and were broken and reformed and came again. And the line, somehow, held. The worst of that night fell on the headquarters in the low ground. The Chinese battalion that had swung around the rear came down on the headquarters perimeter. And around the command post, the supporting troops fought as infantry, the machine gun section, and the assault pioneers holding the higher ground until they were overrun near dawn. Among the dead on that ground was a sergeant named Len Lanoy, killed commanding a machine gun section attached to A Company, one of the first of the 32 Australians who would not come down from Kapyong, a man with a name and a section and a job he was doing when the round found him. The headquarters could not hold its low ground. Before first light it was pulled back, and the consequence, however necessary, was severe. The colonel commanding the battalion lost his hold on the wire that connected him to the companies on the ridge above. Communications failed, first between the battalion and the brigade behind it, and then between the battalion and its own forward companies. The men on the hill were now, in every sense that counted, on their own. For some of them, that meant more than being surrounded as a battalion, because small groups found themselves entirely behind the enemy, in one or two cases as much as 4 kilometers beyond the most forward Chinese troops, lying up by day and moving by night to work their way home through country that now belonged to the men trying to kill them. It was into that situation, in the gray pause that came with the dawn of the 24th of April, that the most famous moment of the battle arrived. At first light, a company discovered that the Chinese had infiltrated its position during the darkness, and O'Dowd's men drove them off. And for a moment the line steadied, and there was a chance to call for help. O'Dowd's signaller worked the radio, trying to raise anyone who could send aircraft or guns or ammunition. And at last, an American formation answered. What happened next was remembered for decades afterward by a soldier of the battalion named Patrick Knowles. The American operator would not accept who the Australian operator said he was speaking for. O'Dowd took the handset himself and demanded to be put through to the commanding officer. And when the senior American came on the line, he told O'Dowd, flatly, that the Australians no longer existed, that the 3rd Battalion had been wiped out the night before, and that there was nobody alive on that hill for him to be speaking to. And O'Dowd, with the enemy in his wire and his ammunition running down, told the man he had news for him. They were still there, he said, and they were staying there. That exchange has to be handled with care, because it has been embroidered in the retelling, and the embroidered version is both less accurate and, in the end, less impressive than the truth. In many accounts, the American formation is named as the 1st Marine Division, but the 1st Marine Division was committed elsewhere, away to the west, and the precise identity of the headquarters that wrote the Australians off has never been pinned down. So the honest thing is to call it what it was, an American command that had read a report and believed it. And the moment itself was not. Whatever the title of this story might invite you to imagine. A tale of American soldiers refusing to take orders from an Australian. It was something simpler and stranger. Not a man seizing command of his allies. A man refusing to accept the official news of his own death. The operator who would not believe him was not insubordinate. He was misinformed, working from a casualty return that happened to be wrong. What O'Dowd was fighting, in that instant, was not the United States Army. It was a piece of paper that had already buried him. Believing them dead did not save the living. And the morning brought a fresh catalogue of trials, beginning with one delivered by their own side. The Chinese were pressing hard against D Company near the summit, and aircraft were called in to break up the assault with napalm, and the aircraft missed. The burning fuel came down not on the Chinese, but on the Australians, on one of O'Dowd's own platoons, the fire that was meant to be their salvation falling instead upon the men it had been sent to protect. There is no clean word for what that is. To hold a hill through a night of bayonet work and survive it only to be burned at dawn by the air arm of the alliance you are bleeding to defend. and the record does not offer one. It simply happened, and the men endured it, and they kept their positions. With the sun up, the forward companies could at last see what they were shooting at, and the New Zealand gunners could lay their 25-pounders down with precision. And that combination turned the day into a grinding defensive battle that the Australians, for all their losses, were winning. D Company, holding the high ground toward the summit, beat off attack after attack through the morning, the New Zealand shells falling close in front of its pits to break each rush before it could close. Here the story owes a debt to Bruce Ferguson, the commanding officer whose headquarters had been driven from its ground and whose communications had failed. Because the temptation, in a story built around O'Dowd, is to let Ferguson become the villain of his own battle. And that would be a lie. While O'Dowd held the ridge, Ferguson did something the official history records plainly. In answer to an urgent plea for ammunition and for the evacuation of the wounded, he climbed aboard the tanks of one of Coke's platoons and rode forward into the fire, sitting in the gunloader's seat and learning on the spot how to feed the gun so the tank could fight its way up to the forward companies. The detail that survives is almost comic in its humanity. As the colonel of the battalion frantically learned the loader's trade under fire, the signaller crouched on the floor beside him slept through the whole of it. Ferguson got ammunition to his men, and he got wounded men out. The picture that survives is not one of a coward and a hero. It is the more ordinary and more painful picture of a brave officer whose grip on the battle had been broken by circumstances no map could have foreseen, fighting his way back into it, the only way left to him, while the man on the ridge held the thing together by sheer will. By the middle of the day, the arithmetic had become impossible to argue with. The Chinese dominated the road south. The position could not be supplied or evacuated through another night. And to stay on Hill 504 after dark was to invite the very annihilation that the American report had already, prematurely, recorded. At about 12:30, Ferguson reached O'Dowd by radio and gave the order that hands this story, finally and explicitly, to the major from the goldfields. He told O'Dowd to plan and conduct the withdrawal of the rifle companies. And Jim Stone, the Canadian colonel listening on the radio net from his own hill, heard Ferguson say that he could no longer keep control of the battle. It was not a collapse of nerve. It was an honest man telling another honest man the truth of where the wire had failed, and handing the fight to the officer best placed to win it. What O'Dowd did with that order is the reason his soldiers never forgave the army for forgetting him. He could not use the road because the road belonged to the enemy. So he took the battalion out along a ridge that ran some 3 kilometers to the southwest of Hill 504, keeping perhaps 500 meters clear of the river and away from the killing ground of the road. And he brought the companies down it by bounds, each holding in turn to cover the next as it moved, so that at every moment some part of the battalion was in position to fire, while another part was up and exposed. The New Zealand gunners fired onto the Australians' own abandoned positions to deny them to the Chinese and to screen the move. And the companies came down the ridge in their turn and linked up at last with the waiting Middlesex at the ford. They had been cut off and surrounded by a force more than 10 times their number. They had been written off as destroyed. They had been bombed by their own aircraft. And they came off that hill in good order. Not a rout, a withdrawal. And in the conduct of it, in the bringing of 4 rifle companies down a ridge under the guns of a Chinese division, the battalion did not lose a single man. They held, and then they left on their own terms. And the men who walked out remembered for the rest of their lives who had walked them out. The battle was not over when the Australians reached the ford, because the Chinese, having failed to break the eastern hill, turned the full weight of their effort against the western one. Through the night of the 24th and into the 25th of April, it was the Canadians' turn. the 2nd Battalion of the Patricias on Hill 677. And Jim Stone refused to give up the height. He held it when one of his forward platoons was overrun and had to be retaken, when his own headquarters was attacked, and when the position was so closely beset that the only way to keep his men supplied was to drop stores to them from the air. At the height of the crisis, the Canadians called artillery fire down onto their own hilltop to throw the attackers off, and it worked. The ammunition that kept the whole battalion firing reached it not up a road, which the Chinese controlled, but out of the sky in an airdrop flown over a surrounded position among the first of its kind in that war. And the company that had borne the worst of the fighting held its ground to the end. By the morning of the 25th of April, which happened to be Anzac Day, the day on which Australians and New Zealanders honor their war dead, the Chinese had spent themselves against the Commonwealth Hills and could do no more. They had lost, on these two features, well over 2,000 men. They broke off the attack. American troops of the 5th Cavalry pushed forward, cleared the Chinese from Hill 504, and reopened the road, and the Battle of Kapyong was over. The road to Seoul had been held. The spring offensive, here in the center as on the Imjin to the west, had been stopped, and within weeks it collapsed altogether, and the war settled into a long stalemate of trench lines and peace talks that would consume 2 more years. The cost to the Australians was 32 men killed, more than 50 wounded, and 3 taken prisoner. Not all of the missing were dead. The 3 prisoners had been swept up in the confusion of the first night. And for them, Kapyong was the beginning of years of cold and hunger in the camps along the Yalu. Years their families spent not knowing whether they were alive. The Canadians lost 10 killed and 23 wounded. The Chinese dead were never counted with any precision, but they numbered in the thousands, and they had been spent in the pursuit of a city they did not reach. Set against the scale of what was at stake, the cost had been astonishingly small. 2 understrength battalions and their supporting gunners and tanks had stopped a force many times their size and blunted the central thrust of the largest offensive China launched in the whole war. And they had done it for the loss of a little over 40 men killed between them. Those who studied the war afterward came to speak of Kapyong in the center and the Imjin River in the west as the twin hinges on which that offensive turned. The places where small Commonwealth forces, badly outnumbered, bought the time that held the line. And it was after all of this, after the hill and the radio and the napalm and the ridge, that Reg Saunders set down the truest thing anyone has said about Kapyong. Frustrated by much of what he had seen of the war before this, he wrote that at Kapyong, at last, he felt like an Anzac, and that he imagined there were 600 others who felt the same. It is a quiet sentence, and it carries an enormous weight, because the word Anzac is the word Australians reserve for belonging, for being fully and finally one of the nation's own. And a man whose people had been shut out of so much of that nation's life was saying that on this hill, in this company, he had at last been let all the way in. For holding that line, the honors came, and they came generously, and they came, at first, almost entirely from the Americans. On the 23rd of June, 1951, by general order of the 8th United States Army, 3 units were cited for extraordinary heroism near Kapyong. The 3rd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, a company of the Patricias, and the company of the 72nd Heavy Tank Battalion. The very Americans whose tanks had carried Ferguson forward and the wounded back. The citation spoke of forward elements completely surrounded, of waves of troops thrown again and again at the defenders, of ammunition running low with no time for food, and of commanders who, in some instances, directed friendly artillery onto their own positions to break the assaults. The decoration was the Distinguished Unit Citation, later renamed the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest award a unit of the American Army can receive, and it was pinned to the colors of a foreign battalion by General James Van Fleet himself in a ceremony on the 4th of December, 1951. The Commonwealth honored the action too, with the Battle honor Kapyong, which the Royal Australian Regiment shares with the Patricias and the Middlesex, and which is emblazoned on the regiment's colors to this day. Instructors in military academies took to describing the action as something close to the perfect defensive battle, and Bruce Ferguson was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his leadership, and he had earned it, and it was right that he received it. But Ben O'Dowd received nothing. The man whose foresight had predicted the infiltration, who had held that ridge through the night and into the morning, who had told an Allied general that his dead battalion was still alive and staying, and who had then brought every one of his rifle companies down from that ridge without losing a man in the withdrawal, was given no individual decoration for any of it. His soldiers knew what he had done. One of them, a man who rose himself to the rank of brigadier, would write that there had been many heroes in that battle, but that in the minds of the soldiers there was no doubt at all that O'Dowd had fought it and had brought the battalion to safe haven, and that the lack of recognition for him rankled with the Kapyong veterans for the rest of their lives. Not for the want of courage, for the want somehow of the right witness in the right office at the right moment. It is one of the recurring truths of war that the medal and the deed do not always find each other, and at Kapyong they did not. The sense that the record had not been set straight did not fade with the years. If anything, it sharpened, because the men who had been there refused to let it go. They told the story at their reunions, and to anyone who would listen, and in time, some of them wrote it down. O'Dowd himself, late in life, set out his account of the battle from the inside, and decades after the fighting, a full biography of him appeared, putting the orphan from the goldfields where his soldiers had always said he belonged, at the center of the story rather than at its margin. And then, having done all of it, the men of Kapyong came home to a country that did not much want to hear about it. Korea was already becoming what it has been ever since, the forgotten war, fought in the long shadow of the Second World War and overtaken before it ended by the politics of a new and uneasy age. The soldiers who had won a United States Presidential Citation found that their own nation could barely locate the country they had fought in. And some of them would remember being turned away from the clubs of the Returned and Services League by older men who told them, to their faces, that Korea had not been a proper war. They had stopped a Chinese division on the road to Seoul. They wore on their colors an honor the American Army does not give lightly. And they came home to be told that what they had done did not quite count. It was not a small thing the country had committed and then mislaid. Many thousands of Australians served in Korea over the 3 years of the war, and hundreds of them did not come home, and they had fought one of the most determined enemies their army ever faced. Yet the war slipped into a gap in the national memory, too soon after the Second World War to stand clear of its shadow, and too distant, too strange, and too inconclusive to take a firm grip of its own. The distance between what those men were and the memory their country gave them is, in the end, the real subject of this story. The same distance that ran between O'Dowd's deed and O'Dowd's empty chest. And it says nothing whatever about the quality of the soldiers and everything, about the quality of the attention that was paid to them. The attention has come slowly in the decades since. Each year on the 24th of April, the eve of Anzac Day, Kapyong is now formally remembered not only in Australia but in Canada and in South Korea, the country whose capital was saved by the stand in the valley. The 3rd Battalion carried the name into its own daily life, so that its home barracks bear the name Kapyong Lines, and soldiers born half a century after the fighting now train under it. In the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, there is a diorama of the valley, the hills and the ridge and the river rendered in miniature, so that visitors can see the whole shape of the trap and the stand at once. South Korea, whatever Australia did or did not do, has not forgotten. The country that lay open at the foot of that valley is now one of the wealthiest and most advanced on earth. Its freedoms built on the breathing space that soldiers like these bought in the spring of 1951. And it has made a point of honoring the foreigners who fought for it. It is a strange and a moving thing that the plainest gratitude for what happened on those hills has come, in the end, not from the soldiers' own country, but from the one they were sent to save. The men themselves lived on into that slow remembering. Reg Saunders left the Army and became one of the first liaison officers in the Office of Aboriginal Affairs, a respected voice for his people, and sat on the council of the very war memorial that holds the diorama of his battle. A road in Canberra carries his name, and he died in 1990. Bruce Ferguson commanded another battalion, instructed a generation of officers, and soldiered for many more years before retiring as a colonel. He died in 1988. And Ben O'Dowd, the ward of the state who became the soldier his men would not stop talking about, went on to the jungles of the Malayan Emergency, and then spent a decade of his retirement building the State Emergency Service of Victoria into a real institution. He died in 2012 at the age of 93. Still, in the eyes of the soldiers who had been on the hill, the man who had not been given his due. There is a lesson in Kapyong for soldiers, and the academies teach it, that a small, well-led force with good ground, disciplined fire, and the nerve to hold can break a much larger one, and that the friction of a coalition, the tangled command, and the crossed wires and the casualty returns that arrive faster than the truth can be as dangerous as the enemy in front. But the larger lesson is not tactical at all, and it is the one this story has been circling from the beginning. Go back, at the end, to the dawn of the 24th of April, 1951, and to the American voice telling Ben O'Dowd that he and his battalion were dead, wiped out, gone, that there was nobody alive on that hill for him to be speaking to. The record now answers that voice, and the answer is written on the colors of a regiment. They were not dead. They held the ridge through the night and through the morning. They were burned by their own aircraft, and they held. They came down without losing a man, and for it, they were given the highest decoration that the army that had buried them can bestow, pinned to their colors by an American general's own hand. 32 of them did not come home. Len Lanoy did not come home from his machine gun, and 31 others did not come home with him. And the man who brought the rest of them off that hill alive was never given a medal for doing it. Kapyong is held now mostly by the people who were there and by the few who have learned to look for it. A battle won by men whom a forgotten war forgot. The fortress in the valley still standing in a memory that took half a century to arrive. If you believe these men deserve to be remembered, say so in the comments. And if you want to see the battle that was being fought to the west, while Kapyong held the center, the last stand of the Gloucesters on the Imjin River, watch this next.